This video was sponsored by Sands of Doom, a new 5e campaign from Mr. Rex, now on Kickstarter. Hello and welcome to Monster of the Week, the only show on the internet that isn't too scared to talk about the giant mummified octopus in the room. That's right folks, this week we're talking about the crawling apocalypse. If you've ever wondered what would happen to a colossal kraken-like monster if it was the antagonist of a Brendan Fraser film, this is the video for you. Whoa! As always, my goal this week is to investigate and explore everything there is to know about the crawling apocalypse, including its lore and publication history. Then, ultimately, we're going to convert it from 3rd edition D&D into 5th edition with some shiny new stats. So if you're ready to hear about the most horrific sea monster turned undead abomination, I'm ready to tell you everything there is to know. In March of 2005, the Dungeons & Dragons team released a book called Sandstorm, which, as the name suggests, was all about role-playing in the fantasy desert of your dreams, or nightmares, I guess, depending on how things go. If you like long walks under the blazing sun, dying of dehydration, and staring longingly into a sea of dunes while your brain melts, Sandstorm might just be the book for you. In addition to all kinds of new rules, locations, spells, races, classes, and equipment related to traversing the desert region known as the Waste, we also got a slew of new monsters that like to hang out in the sand. Surprising absolutely no one, a fair amount of these new creatures are undead, because, as it turns out, chilling in the Waste for elongated periods of time isn't exactly conducive to living a long and happy life. And this week's monster is no exception. On page 143, we find artwork depicting this weird bug thing and the first half of the Crawling Apocalypse's game entry. Can I just say, as awesome as some of these 3.5 monster books are, I am so glad they stopped doing this continuous monster entry thing when they were formatting the books going forward. Like, when we look at 5th edition books, each monster entry is on one page. You have the monster's art, its name, and a brief description with the stats and everything there. You're not continuing to read that monster's lore entry like into the next page while artwork of a new monster is being shown to you, and then that has to catch up with that monster's entry, so things just start to get muddled and confusing. I mean, yes, there are some monsters that bleed into the next page, but then that entire page also belongs to that monster. There's never this weird crossover thing happening. It's so wild to read a monster's flavor text and have an image of a completely different creature right beside it. I digress. On page 144, we actually get to see the Crawling Apocalypse, and it looks awesome. This creature is essentially a gargantuan undead cephalopod. The book isn't exactly clear about what kind of creature it was before it became undead, but it's pretty clear that before it was an undead monstrosity, the creature was something akin to a giant octopus, or maybe even a kraken. But the Crawling Apocalypse isn't just an undead. It's technically a type of mummy. This is interesting to me for a couple different reasons, but primarily because in order to create a mummy, you have to do a lot of extra work, much more so than is required to create a simple skeleton or a zombie. And as a result, mummies are quite often a lot more powerful, but creating one is a commitment. So, who created the Crawling Apocalypse? That would be the Maru. The Maru are an enigmatic and ancient race that appears throughout the book. Not much is really known about them, however, it is clear that they were highly advanced in the ways of magic. The short version of this story is that they were constantly at war with each other and other civilizations that surrounded them. And these numerous wars involved horrible losses for both sides, and eventually they warred themselves right on into extinction. The Maru, it seems, were particularly good at using magic to create other living creatures, which they used to fight these wars for them. In fact, they were so good at it that many of their creations outlived even them. You can probably see where this is going. The creatures they created called Maru Spawn are one such example of this. These guys are basically jackal-headed soldiers that turned into their own civilization once there were no more wars left to fight. All this biological tampering led to these wars being dubbed the Flesh Wars. And quite frankly, I think that's a very bad name for them. So, with the Flesh Wars in full swing, the Maru were constantly looking for new magical innovations to give themselves sometimes a literal leg up on their opponents. And when some of them got the idea to start dabbling with a little necromancy here and there, the first crawling apocalypse was born. Basically, they would go out into the ocean and capture the biggest, baddest sea monster they could find. Once they did so, they would mummify it, create a new type of undead, and then use magic to direct its actions. So now, with the Maru gone, these massive undead tentacled beasts are just kind of left to their own devices. Any of them that were issued a command when the Empire of Maru fell simply continued doing the last thing that they were told to do. For example, if one of them was commanded to guard a temple, some millennia later, that same crawling apocalypse will still be around, guarding that temple. Many of them are likely still entombed, fully mummified, but never unleashed on the world because their creators were destroyed before the opportunity came. In some rare cases, those who didn't have any specific directives but were also not still entombed mostly spend their days roaming around the desert wastes, killing any living being that they come across. See, most mummies, at least in the D&D canon, which is what we're talking about, still have some fragmented memories of who or what they were when they were still alive. This is not always the case, but it certainly is for the crawling apocalypse. While not highly intelligent creatures, they are tormented by visions of their life in the ocean before they were mummified and relegated to being weapons. When we talk about the undead as a trope overall, not even just in D&D or even in role-playing games, but in pop culture at large, a huge theme often explored is the perversion of the natural order. This idea that the undead represents something fundamentally wrong, that each one of them is a sort of grim reflection of what they once were. And I think that idea is really exemplified with the crawling apocalypse. Where they were once likely the most powerful thing in their corner of the ocean, these creatures are now forced to fight on behalf of someone else. Their utter independence was replaced with subservience, and the vast ocean they once called home replaced with a sea of sand and a burning sun. So this rage they experience that leads them to kill almost any living thing on sight comes from a very primordial, ancient, and dark place. It would almost make you feel bad for them. If they weren't trying to rip you limb from limb, that is. Speaking of being ripped apart limb from limb, let's take a moment to hear from our sponsor of the week, the Sands of Doom. Lord Amu, an ancient king, has awoken as a mummy lord with over 30,000 of his old soldiers. The undead horde now marches through the desert towards the small kingdom of Al-Kirat. In order to succeed in Sands of Doom, players will have to empower themselves, assist the capital city, and weaken the enemy. This is an adventure where options and choices are at the forefront. Players will be able to sabotage the enemy army, assassinate its leaders, disrupt its alliances, or slow down its progress through the desert. They will also be able to ally themselves with monstrous species found within the land, remedy political strife within the capital city, and even help prepare the city's defenses against the upcoming siege. This 5e campaign is very open format, allowing the players to decide how and where they want to assist. As decisions are made, some doors will open, while others will be closed forever. Everything the players accomplish will impact how the final siege plays out, including what enemies they face or how difficult it becomes. And of course, no campaign would be complete without a powerful villain. Lord Amu is highly intelligent and will react to every decision the players make, always probing them for weaknesses along the way. So if you want a campaign with adventure, intrigue, and a malevolent mummy lord hell-bent on reclaiming the world as we know it, look no further than the Sands of Doom. now on Kickstarter. The Kickstarter campaign is entering its final phase as this video is uploaded, so I highly encourage you to follow that link down in the description below and check it out. Also, I should mention, it's being created by friend of the channel, Mr. Rex, someone who most of you are probably already familiar with. But for those of you who aren't, he's a fellow YouTuber with a huge library of monster lore videos, and I definitely recommend checking his channel out. I'll be sure to drop a link to his channel down there as well. This isn't part of the ad. I just think his content is cool and you should check it out. Maybe I'm a little biased, but I think the D&D monster lore YouTubers make some of the best content in the game. Now, back to a mummified monstrosity of our very own. The Crawling Apocalypse might be just the random encounter you've been looking for to throw into a desert-themed campaign. But before we get into how we might actually deploy this undead horror at the table, we need to talk about just exactly what it's capable of. Clocking in with a challenge rating of 10, the Crawling Apocalypse covers a wide variety of potential roles in a D&D campaign. Whether you want it to be simply a minion serving under a powerful mummy lord or boss monster in and of itself, it has a few interesting combat quirks that make it really fun to run in battle. For starters, this monster is literally gargantuan in size. That means it occupies a 20-foot square on the battle map, or maybe even more since the gargantuan size classification technically has no upper limit. So basically, it's as big as you want it to be. There are only 22 official monsters in D&D 5e classified as gargantuan, and 11 of them are dragons, so anytime I get to bust out a massive creature to sick on my players, I get very excited. As a gargantuan monster, they not only have a ton of HP, but they also get the siege monster trait, which makes them great at smashing down buildings. And as far as attacks go, they get 4 per round. 2 with their big old tentacles, and 2 more with the remainder of their smaller arms. The 2 tentacle attacks are the thing to watch out for, because if they connect, you are going to take some gnarly damage and get grappled. Plus, those long tentacles have a reach of 25 feet, so if you don't want to get hit by this thing, you need to really keep your distance. The arm attacks are not nearly as far-reaching or as devastating, but if they hit, they still provide a little bit of extra damage to supplement the carnage being dealt by the 2 main appendages. Something else worth noting is that because the Crawling Apocalypse is technically a mummy, it can infect you with everyone's favorite disease. That's right, not since the Booze Mummy video of 2022 have we had to talk about this, but mummy rot is back on the menu. Anytime this thing connects with a tentacle attack, the victim is forced to make a Constitution saving throw against mummy rot. Mummy rot is a particularly heinous condition because it stops you from healing, and then it slowly does damage to you until eventually you die and turn into a bunch of dust. It's also not technically even a disease, it's a curse, so magic that will normally cure diseases will not work here. You need something to remove a curse, such as remove curse. Definitely not something you want to have to deal with while going toe to tentacle in the ring with a giant undead octopus. If you happen to have a party member such as a cleric of appropriate level with you who can cast remove curse, ultimately it's no huge deal once the fight is over, presuming you survived. But if you don't, there's a pretty good chance that you will become the physical manifestation of a popular Eagles song. The Crawling Apocalypse also has a trait that is meant to emphasize just how terrifying it really is. Due to its despair trait, anytime someone looks at the thing, if they're within 1 mile of it, that person has to make a wisdom saving throw or become frightened of the Crawling Apocalypse. Honestly, it seems like something worth being frightened of. But if you do allow it to rustle your jimmies, not only are you scared, but you're also paralyzed for 1d4 rounds. 99% of the time, this trait is only going to come into effect when you're actually near the thing. But if you just happen to see it far away, looking at it through a spyglass or something, the effect is the same. It also has the alert trait, which is very similar to the way the alert feat works, in that it can never be surprised, and creatures don't gain advantage when attacking it just because they're not seen. Sorry to all the rogues watching right now. This might seem ridiculously powerful, but the creature is not without its shortcomings either. For one, they are painfully slow. While it may be able to burrow through the ground to remain unseen, if it actually wants to chase something down, it's gonna have a pretty hard time. Since it only has a 20-foot movement speed, your best option if you don't want to fight it is to simply just walk away. Even if it uses its action to dash, that's still too slow to overtake someone on horseback out for a casual ride. And if the target is dashing too, forget about it. They try to counteract this slow speed by resorting to ambush tactics. Since they have a burrow speed, they love to crawl underneath a target and then burst out from beneath them. Using their tremor sense ability to detect possible prey, the crawling apocalypse has no reason to really expose itself until it's time to attack. They also have virtually no options against someone who is really far away from them with a ranged weapon or someone who's flying through the air. So if their target becomes inaccessible for any reason, they usually result to just burrowing back into the earth. The result here being a stalemate. This makes them pretty easy to avoid for a group of adventurers with access to magic and powerful equipment, unless, of course, the monster is guarding a location they need access to. And of course, if all else fails, as a mummy, the kill it with fire method is always on the table since they are vulnerable to fire damage. But that of course brings me to where, how, and why you might actually encounter a crawling apocalypse. So, you want to use an ungodly man-made mummified horror beyond mortal comprehension in your D&D campaign. Let's figure out how to make that happen. The first thing you need to decide is under what context the creature is involved in your story. Is it a newly created monster? Perhaps a powerful mummy lord or lich has dried up an ocean and converted it into a desert rife with the undead. Or maybe this mummy lord was entombed with a bunch of undead minions, a crawling apocalypse among them, and now for some reason they have awakened to wreak havoc on the world. Whatever the setup, in this context, a crawling apocalypse is a very powerful tool at the disposal of a necromancer or lich or other undead villain. I mean, this thing could be used to attack and wipe out entire towns. I guess that's where the name comes from. But if there's one thing practitioners of the undead need, it's bodies, and wiping out a small border town with a crawling apocalypse is a real fast and easy way to get a bunch of bodies. If you want to go the lich route, it could also be used as a guardian for their phylactery, or even a guardian of a mummy lord's tomb. And hell, if a huge battle is about to erupt, maybe your big bad villain is using this thing as a mount to ride into combat with. One way I actually think this creature could be used as a really effective encounter is as a sort of troop transporting device. Imagine that the necromancer in charge wants to take out a town, village, or city. What better way to do that than to send in a crawling apocalypse burrowing underground, only to have it burst from below in the middle of the city? And maybe a bunch of skeletons, zombies, mummies, or other undead are hanging onto its smaller legs. So that way it can erupt from below and then send out a small wave of soldiers. And maybe among those undead soldiers is an undead spellcaster who can cast Animate Dead. So their strategy is to burst from the ground and just start killing people. Then the undead spellcaster goes and starts animating the corpses of the slain townsfolk. If any actual threats appear, the soldiers will move to protect the spellcaster to ensure that they can keep casting Animate Dead. All the while, the crawling apocalypse is just tearing down buildings and killing anything that moves. This would rapidly destroy an unprepared settlement in a very short amount of time. And who knows, maybe the players are there when it happens. If they're not very high level, maybe just throw some zombies at them that have been raised by this undead necromancer, and for them, the goal is just to survive. After this initial scene, they can escape the city and start forming a plan. This could be a great opener to a campaign because then way later down the road, once they've leveled up and become a bit more powerful, when they encounter the crawling apocalypse a second time, they'll be ready. And if your players are already a high enough level where they could actually fight something like this, that could just be a really cool combat encounter. In that case, I'd be sure to throw in a handful of NPC citizens who are trying to escape the clutches of the crawling apocalypse to give your players a chance to do something heroic. And if you don't like the idea of using an undead monster like this in the game, you could always just adjust things and not make it undead. In order to make this creature just a roaming, alive monstrosity, you'd have to drop the mummy rot and fire vulnerability traits, but other than that, there's no reason this couldn't just be some kind of weird land octopus thing that haunts the desert. So if languishing in undeath isn't your vibe, but you otherwise like the idea of this monster, that could work. The final way I could think of to use this monster that was a little bit outside of the box is as a sort of living trap. Now, this idea is a little bit mean, but just bear with me. Imagine you build an entire dungeon around one of these creatures. Basically, the crawling apocalypse will be relegated to a 20-foot cube with the entirety of the dungeon's hallways built around this center area. So we've got our central cube, crawling apocalypse, entombed inside of it. But then, in all of the hallways that are touching the central cube, you build small tunnels that the crawling apocalypse can attack through using its tentacles. Because it has tremor sense, it would be able to detect anything in the hallways around it, and being able to reach out and attack with its tentacles anywhere one of these holes is present would most definitely cause problems for any adventurers trying to traverse the halls. Using readied actions, they could probably bait out an attack from the tentacle and then cause some damage directly to them, and maybe once it's taken a few big hits, the monster will back off a little bit. But this concept could be really interesting, I think. And then, if you have the final room of the dungeon be an encounter with the crawling apocalypse, it'll give your players a chance to confront the thing that's been harassing them all this time that they were exploring. Or maybe you just use them as a random encounter in some kind of upcoming desert-themed adventure where undead monsters are popping up all over the land. But however you choose to use this monster, everything you need to run it successfully is linked down in the description below in the form of a Google document. So if you're not playing 3.5, but you are playing 5th edition D&D, all the stats, lore, and everything else is down there and ready to be dropped on your game table. And if you are one of my lovely patrons, over on the Patreon page, you can find the Dungeon Dad style Monster of the Week stat block in the form of a high-res PDF. All the information is the same, but the presentation's a little bit fancier, and by subscribing to the Patreon, it helps support me and the channel. And all this talk of patrons reminds me, it is time for Patron of the Week. This week's randomly selected patron is C. Davis. Thank you so much for the support. It's always good to see you around. And thank you for watching. I appreciate it immensely, and once again, thank you to Mr. Rex for sponsoring this video. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like and or a comment, and if you are new here, definitely consider hitting that subscribe button because there are so many more monsters out there to talk about, and I've got some awesome stuff coming up that you're not going to want to miss. Also, if there's a monster you'd like to see me cover on Monster of the Week, be sure to let me know in the comments down below or over on Discord in the Monster Suggestions community page, and who knows, you might just see it show up on Monster of the Week. But that's all for today though, so once again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then.